The weight of Timothy Kim's head against Alexander Alvarez's shoulder felt like the most natural thing in the world, and that terrified him more than anything else ever had. They were sitting on the worn leather couch in their shared apartment, the late evening light filtering through half-closed blinds, casting golden shadows across the room. Timothy had been talking about his latest breakup with his girlfriend of 8 months, his voice growing softer and more distant as he described the hollow feeling that had been eating at him for weeks. Then he had simply let his head fall back, and somehow it had landed perfectly against Alexander's shoulder, as if it belonged there. Alexander's heart hammered against his ribs as he tried to keep his breathing steady. Timothy's dark hair smelled like vanilla and something uniquely him, a scent that had haunted Alexander's dreams for the better part of 2 years. The warmth radiating from Timothy's body seemed to seep through Alexander's thin cotton shirt, making every nerve ending come alive with an electricity he had been trying to ignore for so long. This moment felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong move could send everything crashing down into the abyss below. Timothy shifted slightly, his breath warm against Alexander's neck, as he whispered, "I don't know what's wrong with me, Alex. I keep thinking there's something missing, something I can't quite put my finger on. Every relationship feels like I'm playing a part that doesn't fit right, like I'm reading lines from a script that was written for someone else." The confession hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross, but both desperately wanted to explore. Alexander's hand trembled slightly as he reached up to run his fingers through Timothy's hair, the gesture so natural and intimate that it felt like breathing. Timothy's eyes fluttered closed at the touch, and a soft sigh escaped his lips that made Alexander's world tilt on its axis. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, this precipice of possibility and terror, we need to go back to the beginning, to the day when Alexander first realized that his feelings for his best friend had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. 3 months earlier, Alexander had been sitting in the same spot on the couch, watching Timothy pace back and forth across their small living room like a caged animal. Timothy had just gotten off the phone with his girlfriend, and his frustration was palpable, radiating off him in waves that made the air feel thick and charged. Alexander had been pretending to read a book, but his eyes kept drifting to the way Timothy's hands moved as he gestured, the way his jaw clenched when he was upset, the way the afternoon sunlight caught the copper highlights in his dark hair. "She doesn't understand me," Timothy had said, running both hands through his hair in a gesture that Alexander had cataloged as one of his favorites. "We've been together for 5 months, and sometimes I feel like she's dating a stranger, like she's in love with some version of me that doesn't actually exist." Alexander had set his book aside, giving Timothy his full attention the way he always did when his friend needed to talk. The ache in his chest that had become his constant companion over the past year intensified as he watched Timothy struggle with feelings he couldn't quite articulate. Alexander knew that ache intimately, had been carrying it around like a stone in his chest since the day he realized that what he felt for Timothy went far beyond friendship. "What do you mean?" Alexander had asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the way his heart was racing. Timothy had stopped pacing and turned to face him, his dark eyes filled with a confusion that made Alexander want to cross the room and pull him into his arms. "I mean that when I'm with her, I feel like I'm performing," Timothy had said, sinking down onto the couch beside Alexander. "Like I'm trying to be the boyfriend she wants me to be, but it doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel like me. And the worst part is I don't know what would feel real. I don't know what I actually want." The conversation had continued for hours, winding through topics of love and connection and what it meant to truly know someone. Alexander had found himself walking a tightrope, offering comfort and advice while carefully hiding the fact that every word Timothy spoke felt like a knife turning in his chest. Because Alexander knew exactly what Timothy was missing, could see it so clearly it was almost blinding. Timothy was looking for something real, something genuine, something that would make him feel like himself instead of like he was playing a role. And Alexander was right there, had been right there all along, loving him with a fierce intensity that sometimes left him breathless. But Timothy was straight, had always been straight, had never given any indication that he might be interested in anything more than friendship. So Alexander had learned to be content with being the person Timothy came to when he needed to talk, the one who listened without judgment, the one who knew exactly how Timothy liked his coffee and what movies made him laugh and what songs he hummed when he thought no one was listening. That night, after Timothy had finally gone to bed, Alexander had sat alone in the living room, staring at the spot where Timothy had been sitting and trying to ignore the way his friend's cologne still lingered in the air. He had wondered, not for the first time, what it would be like to tell Timothy the truth, to say the words that had been burning in his throat for months, to admit that he had been in love with his best friend for so long that he couldn't remember what it felt like not to love him. But the risk was too great. Timothy was the most important person in his life, and Alexander couldn't bear the thought of losing him. So he had swallowed the words, pushed them down deep where they joined all the other confessions he had never made, and told himself that being Timothy's friend was enough. It had to be enough. The weeks that followed had been a special kind of torture. Timothy's relationship with his girlfriend had grown increasingly strained, and he had started spending more and more time at home, seeking comfort in Alexander's presence in ways that felt both wonderful and devastating. They had fallen into a routine of late-night conversations, sitting on opposite ends of the couch with cups of tea growing cold between them as they talked about everything and nothing. Alexander had become an expert at reading Timothy's moods, at knowing when he needed space and when he needed company. He had learned to recognize the particular way Timothy's shoulders slumped when he was feeling lost, the way his voice got softer when he was being vulnerable, the way his eyes lit up when Alexander said something that made him laugh. Every detail had been cataloged and treasured, stored away in Alexander's memory like precious artifacts. One evening in early November, Timothy had come home from a date looking particularly defeated. He had slumped onto the couch beside Alexander, closer than usual, and had stared at the ceiling for several long minutes before speaking. "I think I might be broken," he had said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Alexander had felt his heart clench at the words, at the genuine pain in Timothy's voice. "You're not broken," Alexander had replied, the words coming out more fiercely than he had intended. Timothy had turned to look at him, surprise flickering across his features at the intensity in Alexander's voice. "How can you be so sure?" Timothy had asked, and Alexander had seen something in his friend's eyes that he had never seen before, a vulnerability so raw and deep that it took his breath away. "Because I know you," Alexander had said simply. "I know you better than anyone, and you're not broken. You're just looking for something real." The conversation that had followed had been one of the most intimate they had ever shared. Timothy had talked about feeling like he was drifting through life without a compass, about the growing sense that he was living someone else's dreams instead of his own. Alexander had listened, offering comfort and understanding while carefully keeping his own feelings locked away. But something had shifted that night. Timothy had moved closer on the couch, close enough that their knees were touching, close enough that Alexander could feel the heat radiating from his friend's body. When Timothy had finally fallen asleep, his head tilted back against the couch cushions, Alexander had allowed himself one moment of weakness. He had reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair away from Timothy's forehead, his fingers lingering for just a second longer than necessary. Timothy had stirred at the touch, his eyes fluttering open to meet Alexander's. For a heartbeat, they had simply looked at each other, the air between them charged with something Alexander didn't dare name. Then Timothy had smiled sleepily and whispered, "Thanks for always being here, Alex. I don't know what I'd do without you." The words had been like a gift and a curse all at once. Alexander had helped Timothy to his room that night, had watched him disappear behind his bedroom door, and had spent the rest of the night lying awake wondering what that moment had meant, if it had meant anything at all. The next few weeks had brought a subtle change in their dynamic. Timothy had started seeking out physical contact in small ways, brushing their hands together when he passed Alexander something, sitting close enough on the couch that their shoulders touched, lingering in doorways when he said goodnight. Alexander had tried to tell himself that he was imagining things, that his feelings were making him see signs that weren't really there. But then Timothy had broken up with his girlfriend. He had come home that evening looking simultaneously relieved and terrified, and had immediately sought out Alexander's company. They had talked for hours about the breakup, about Timothy's growing certainty that he had been trying to force something that was never meant to be. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, Timothy had asked a question that had stopped Alexander's heart. "Alex," he had said, his voice careful and hesitant, "have you ever wondered what it would be like to kiss someone of the same gender?" The question had hung in the air between them like a live wire, crackling with possibility and danger. Alexander had felt his mouth go dry, his heart hammering so hard he was sure Timothy could hear it. Timothy had continued quickly, as if trying to fill the silence. "It's probably a weird question. I've just been thinking about it lately, about what I might be missing, about whether the reason nothing feels right is because I'm looking in the wrong places." Alexander had managed to find his voice, though it had come out rougher than he intended. "I think it's natural to be curious about things," he had said carefully. "There's nothing weird about questioning what you want." Timothy had nodded, but his eyes had remained fixed on Alexander's face with an intensity that made Alexander feel exposed and vulnerable. "Do you think," Timothy had asked slowly, "that sometimes we convince ourselves we want certain things because that's what we're supposed to want?" The conversation had continued deep into the night, circling around questions of identity and desire and the courage it took to be honest with yourself about what you really wanted. Alexander had found himself walking an even finer line than usual, offering support and understanding while trying to keep his own desperate hope from showing. When they had finally said goodnight, Timothy had lingered in the hallway outside his bedroom, looking like he wanted to say something more. But whatever it was had remained unspoken, and Alexander had gone to bed that night with his mind racing and his heart full of a dangerous, fragile hope. The days that followed Timothy's breakup had been filled with a new kind of tension. Timothy had seemed lighter in some ways, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But there was also a restlessness about him that Alexander had never seen before. He had started asking more questions, seemingly casual inquiries about Alexander's past relationships, about what Alexander was looking for in a partner, about whether Alexander had ever felt like he was settling for something that wasn't quite right. Alexander had answered as honestly as he dared, walking the careful line between truth and self-preservation that had become second nature to him. But with each conversation, he could feel the walls he had built around his feelings starting to crack. Timothy's questions felt pointed, intentional, as if he was searching for something specific in Alexander's responses. One evening, about 2 weeks after the breakup, Timothy had suggested they cook dinner together. It was something they did occasionally, but this time felt different somehow. Timothy had been unusually attentive, standing close to Alexander at the kitchen counter, their arms brushing as they chopped vegetables and seasoned the pasta. The casual touches had felt electric, each brief contact sending sparks through Alexander's nervous system. They had eaten by candlelight, not because it was romantic, but because the overhead light in their small dining area had burned out, and neither of them had bothered to replace it. But the soft, flickering light had created an intimate atmosphere that made every glance feel weighted with meaning. Timothy had been unusually quiet during dinner, stealing glances at Alexander when he thought Alexander wasn't looking. After they had finished eating, they had moved back to their usual spots on the couch, but Timothy had chosen to sit closer than normal. Close enough that Alexander could smell his cologne, close enough that when Timothy shifted position, their legs would brush together. They had been watching a movie, some romantic comedy that neither of them was really paying attention to, when Timothy had suddenly turned to face Alexander. "Alex," he had said, his voice soft and uncertain, "can I ask you something personal?" Alexander had muted the television and turned to give Timothy his full attention, his heart already starting to race at the serious expression on his friend's face. "Of course," he had replied. Timothy had been quiet for a long moment, seeming to gather his courage. "When you've been in relationships," he had finally said, "have you ever felt like you were holding back part of yourself? Like there was something you weren't allowing yourself to want?" The question had hit Alexander like a physical blow, so close to his own truth that he had to fight to keep his expression neutral. "I think everyone holds back parts of themselves sometimes," he had said carefully. "It's scary to be completely vulnerable with someone." But Timothy had shaken his head, frustration flickering across his features. "No, that's not what I mean," he had said. "I mean like you were pretending to want something because that's what was expected of you, but deep down you knew it wasn't really what you needed." Alexander had felt his breath catch in his throat. The conversation felt like it was heading toward dangerous territory, toward confessions that could change everything between them. "Are you talking about your relationship with Sarah?" he had asked, though he suspected the question went much deeper than that. Timothy had run a hand through his hair, that gesture that Alexander loved so much. "Maybe," he had said, "or maybe I'm talking about everything. Maybe I'm talking about the fact that I've spent my whole life trying to be the person I thought I was supposed to be, and I'm just now starting to wonder if that person is actually me." The vulnerability in Timothy's voice had been almost overwhelming. Alexander had wanted nothing more than to reach out and take Timothy's hand, to offer comfort and reassurance, but he had been afraid that any movement might break the spell of honesty that had settled over them. "What do you think you want?" Alexander had asked quietly, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Timothy had looked at him for a long moment, his dark eyes searching Alexander's face as if looking for something. "I think," he had said slowly, "that I want to stop being afraid of my own feelings. I think I want to stop pretending that what I have is enough when I know there's something more out there." The words had hung between them, heavy with implication. Alexander had felt his heart hammering against his ribs, hope and terror warring in his chest. Before he could respond, Timothy had continued, "I think I want to be brave enough to explore what I really feel, instead of just accepting what I think I'm supposed to feel." The conversation had continued for another hour, circling around questions of identity and desire and the courage it took to be honest with yourself. But underneath it all, Alexander had sensed something building, a tension that felt like a storm gathering on the horizon. When they had finally said goodnight, Timothy had hesitated at his bedroom door, turning back to look at Alexander with an expression that had made Alexander's pulse quicken. "Sleep well, Alex," Timothy had said softly, and there had been something in his voice that sounded almost like a promise. The next few days had passed in a haze of heightened awareness. Every interaction between them had felt charged with new meaning. Every casual touch had seemed to linger a moment longer than necessary. Alexander had caught Timothy looking at him with a new intensity, as if seeing him for the first time. And Timothy had started finding excuses to be close to him, sitting beside him on the couch instead of across from him, standing near him in the kitchen while they made coffee, brushing past him in the hallway with touches that felt anything but accidental. Alexander had been trying to convince himself that he was reading too much into things, that his own desperate hope was making him see signs that weren't really there. But then Timothy had done something that had shattered all of Alexander's carefully constructed defenses. It had been a Friday evening, and they had been sitting on the couch watching television when Timothy had suddenly turned to him with a look of nervous determination. "Alex," he had said, his voice slightly breathless, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise you won't think I'm crazy." Alexander had felt his heart stop, then start again at double speed. "I promise," he had managed to say, though his voice had come out rougher than he intended. Timothy had taken a deep breath, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other night," he had said, "about wanting to be brave enough to explore what I really feel." And I think he had paused, his eyes meeting Alexander's with an intensity that had made Alexander's breath catch. "I think I've been lying to myself about what I want." Alexander had felt the world tilt on its axis, hope and terror flooding through him in equal measure. "What do you mean?" he had whispered, barely able to get the words out. Timothy had moved closer on the couch, close enough that Alexander could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "I mean that when I think about what's been missing from my relationships, when I think about what real connection feels like," he had said, his voice growing softer with each word, "I think about you." The confession had hit Alexander like a physical blow, so unexpected and overwhelming that for a moment he had forgotten how to breathe. Timothy had continued, his words coming faster now, as if he was afraid he would lose his courage. "I think about the way you listen to me. Really listen. Like what I'm saying matters. I think about how safe I feel with you, how I can be completely myself without worrying about whether I'm being the right kind of person. I think about how you know exactly what I need before I even know it myself." Alexander had stared at Timothy, unable to process what he was hearing. This was everything he had dreamed of and never dared to hope for, but it felt too surreal to be actually happening. And lately, Timothy had continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I've been thinking about what it would feel like to kiss you." The words had hung in the air between them like a confession and a question all at once. Alexander had felt his heart hammering so hard he was sure Timothy could hear it, had felt his hands trembling with the effort of holding himself back. Timothy, he had breathed, and the name had come out like a prayer. Timothy had reached out then, his fingers brushing against Alexander's cheek with a touch so gentle it had made Alexander's eyes flutter closed. "I know this is probably crazy," Timothy had whispered. "I know I'm probably ruining everything by saying this, but I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just friendship." Alexander had opened his eyes to find Timothy looking at him with a mixture of hope and terror that mirrored his own feelings exactly. The careful walls he had built around his heart had crumbled completely, leaving him exposed and vulnerable, and more hopeful than he had ever been in his life. "Tim," he had said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I've been in love with you for 2 years." The confession had slipped out before he could stop it, 2 years of hidden feelings spilling into the space between them. Timothy's eyes had widened, his breath catching in a soft gasp. 2 years, Timothy had repeated, wonder and something that might have been relief coloring his voice. "You've felt this way for 2 years and never said anything." Alexander had nodded, unable to trust his voice. Timothy had cupped his face in both hands then, his thumbs brushing across Alexander's cheekbones with infinite tenderness. "God, Alex," Timothy had whispered, "all this time I've been searching for something that was right here." And then Timothy had leaned forward and kissed him. The kiss had been everything Alexander had imagined, and nothing like he had expected all at once. Timothy's lips had been soft and warm against his, tentative at first, as if testing the waters of this new territory they were exploring together. Alexander had felt his entire world narrow down to that single point of contact, every nerve ending coming alive with an electricity that made his head spin. Timothy had pulled back after a moment, his breathing unsteady, his eyes searching Alexander's face for any sign of regret or hesitation. But all Alexander had been able to do was stare at him in wonder, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. "Was that okay?" Timothy had asked softly, his voice uncertain despite the fact that Alexander was sure his own feelings were written clearly across his face. Instead of answering with words, Alexander had reached up and tangled his fingers in Timothy's hair, pulling him down for another kiss. This one had been deeper, more certain, as the initial shock gave way to a desperate need to make up for all the time they had lost. Timothy had made a soft sound against Alexander's lips, his arms coming up to wrap around Alexander's waist and pull him closer. They had kissed until they were both breathless, until the careful distance they had maintained for so long had completely dissolved. When they finally broke apart, they had remained close, foreheads pressed together, breathing the same air. "I can't believe this is really happening," Timothy had whispered, his voice filled with the same wonder that Alexander was feeling. "I've dreamed about this so many times," Alexander had admitted, the confession slipping out in the haze of overwhelming emotion. "But I never imagined you might feel the same way." Timothy had pulled back slightly to look at him, his eyes soft and serious. "Alex," he had said, "I think I've been feeling this way for longer than I realized. I think all those relationships that felt wrong, all that searching for something I couldn't name, it was because I was looking for you." The words had been like a balm to every insecurity Alexander had carried for the past 2 years. To know that Timothy's feelings were real, that this wasn't just curiosity or experimentation but something deeper, had felt like coming home after a long journey. They had talked for hours that night, sitting curled together on the couch, sharing confessions and fears and hopes for what this new development might mean. Timothy had told Alexander about the growing awareness he had felt over the past few months, the way his feelings for Alexander had slowly shifted from friendship into something deeper and more complex. He had talked about the fear that had kept him from acknowledging those feelings, the terror of losing Alexander if he was wrong about what he was feeling. Alexander had shared his own journey, the gradual realization that his feelings for Timothy went far beyond friendship, the agony of watching Timothy struggle in relationships that clearly weren't right for him while being unable to offer what he knew Timothy was really looking for. He had talked about the countless nights he had lain awake, wondering what it would be like to tell Timothy the truth, the careful balance he had maintained between being supportive and protecting his own heart. As the night had worn on, they had grown more comfortable with this new dynamic, with the freedom to touch and hold each other in ways they had never allowed themselves before. Timothy had traced patterns on Alexander's arm while they talked, his fingers leaving trails of fire in their wake. Alexander had played with Timothy's hair, marveling at how natural it felt to be able to touch him this way. When they had finally decided to go to bed, they had stood in the hallway between their rooms, reluctant to separate even for sleep. Timothy had kissed Alexander again, soft and sweet and full of promise. "This changes everything," Timothy had whispered against Alexander's lips. "Is that okay?" Alexander had asked, suddenly afraid that the reality of what they were doing might be too overwhelming for Timothy. Timothy had smiled, the expression so full of joy and relief that it had taken Alexander's breath away. "It's more than okay," he had said. "It's perfect." They had slept in their own rooms that night, but Alexander had lain awake for hours, replaying every moment of the evening, hardly able to believe that his deepest wish had finally come true. The next morning had brought a new kind of nervousness, the uncertainty of how to navigate this new territory they were exploring together. But Timothy had greeted him in the kitchen with a soft smile and a gentle kiss, and all of Alexander's fears had melted away. They had made breakfast together, stealing touches and sharing glances, learning how to be together in this new way. The weeks that followed had been a revelation. Alexander had thought he knew Timothy well before, but seeing him as a romantic partner had been like discovering an entirely new person. Timothy had been affectionate and attentive in ways that had made Alexander's heart race, seeming to delight in the freedom to touch and hold and kiss him whenever he wanted. They had taken things slowly, both aware that they were navigating uncharted territory. Timothy had been honest about his inexperience with men, about the fears and uncertainties that came with exploring this new aspect of his sexuality. Alexander had been patient and understanding, content to follow Timothy's lead and let him set the pace for their physical relationship. But emotionally, they had dove in headfirst. The foundation of friendship they had built over the years had made the transition to romance feel natural and right in a way that had surprised them both. They had already known each other's quirks and habits, already felt comfortable sharing their deepest thoughts and fears. Adding romance to the mix had felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Timothy had been eager to learn everything about being in a relationship with a man, asking Alexander questions about what he liked, what felt good, what he wanted to try. The conversations had been intimate and vulnerable in ways that had brought them even closer together. Alexander had found himself falling even deeper in love with Timothy's curiosity and openness, with the way he approached this new aspect of himself with such courage and enthusiasm. They had spent countless hours talking about what this meant for their future, about how to navigate the challenges that would come with Timothy's journey of self-discovery. Timothy had been worried about coming out to his family and friends, about the reactions he might face from people who had known him as straight for his entire life. Alexander had offered support and reassurance, sharing his own experiences and helping Timothy prepare for the conversations he would need to have. One evening, about a month after their first kiss, they had been lying in bed together, Timothy's head resting on Alexander's chest while Alexander ran his fingers through his hair. It had become their favorite way to end the day, curled together in the quiet intimacy of Alexander's bedroom, sharing the kind of peaceful contentment that Alexander had never experienced with anyone else. "I need to tell you something," Timothy had said suddenly, his voice soft but serious enough to make Alexander's hand still in his hair. Alexander had felt a flicker of anxiety, wondering if Timothy was having second thoughts about their relationship. "What is it?" he had asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Timothy had lifted his head to look at Alexander, his dark eyes serious but warm. "I've been thinking about that night when I first kissed you," he had said. "About what you said, about being in love with me for 2 years. Alexander had nodded, remembering the way the confession had slipped out in the heat of the moment. Timothy had reached up to cup Alexander's face, his thumb brushing across Alexander's cheekbone. "I want you to know," Timothy had said, his voice filled with quiet intensity, "that I'm completely in love with you too. Not just attracted to you, not just grateful for your patience and understanding, but completely, utterly in love with you." The words had hit Alexander like a physical force, overwhelming in their sincerity and depth. He had known that Timothy cared for him, had seen it in his actions, and heard it in his voice. But hearing the words spoken aloud had been more powerful than he had expected. "I love the way you make me feel like myself," Timothy had continued, his words coming faster now, as if he couldn't hold them back. I love how safe I feel with you, how I never have to pretend to be anything other than exactly who I am. I love your laugh and your terrible jokes and the way you hum when you're cooking. I love how you listen to me. Really listen. Like what I'm saying is the most important thing in the world. Alexander had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion in Timothy's voice. Timothy had leaned down to kiss him then, soft and sweet and full of all the love he had just confessed. I love you, Alex, Timothy had whispered against his lips. I love you in a way I've never loved anyone before, in a way I didn't even know I was capable of loving someone. Alexander had pulled Timothy down for another kiss, pouring all of his own love and gratitude into the connection between them. When they had finally broken apart, both of them had been crying, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had found together. I love you too, Alexander had whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. Timothy had smiled through his tears, the expression so beautiful it had made Alexander's heart ache. Don't be scared, he had said softly. We have each other now. We don't have to be scared anymore. They had fallen asleep that night wrapped around each other, and Alexander had woken up feeling more content and complete than he ever had in his life. The morning had brought a new sense of certainty, a feeling that they had crossed some invisible threshold into something deeper and more permanent. Over the following weeks, they had begun to build a life together in earnest. Timothy had started the process of coming out to his family and friends, and while there had been some difficult conversations, the response had been largely positive. Alexander had been there to support him through each step, offering comfort when things were hard and celebrating with him when they went well. They had also begun to navigate the practical aspects of being a couple, discussing everything from finances to household responsibilities to their long-term goals and dreams. Alexander had been amazed by how naturally they had fallen into a rhythm together, how easily they had been able to merge their individual lives into something shared and beautiful. One evening, about 2 months after they had first kissed, they had been cooking dinner together when Timothy had suddenly stopped what he was doing and turned to face Alexander. I have something I want to ask you, he had said, his voice nervous but determined. Alexander had set down the wooden spoon he had been using to stir the pasta sauce, giving Timothy his full attention. What is it? He had asked. Timothy had taken a deep breath, his hands fidgeting with the dish towel he had been holding. I know we haven't been together very long, he had said, and I know this might seem fast, but I can't imagine my life without you anymore. Alexander had felt his heart start to race, wondering where this conversation was heading. Timothy had reached out to take Alexander's hands in his grip warm and steady. I want to make this official, Timothy had said, his eyes meeting Alexander's with an intensity that had made Alexander's breath catch. I want to move into your room permanently. I want to tell everyone we meet that you're my boyfriend. I want to build a future with you. The words had been like music to Alexander's ears, everything he had dreamed of but had been afraid to hope for. Timothy had continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. I know I'm still figuring out parts of myself, and I know there will probably be challenges ahead, but I want to face them with you. I want us to be a team, a real couple, not just two people who are figuring things out together. Alexander had felt tears spring to his eyes, overwhelmed by the love and commitment in Timothy's voice. Timothy had squeezed his hands, his own eyes bright with emotion. What do you say, Alex? Timothy had asked softly. Will you be my boyfriend, officially and completely? Alexander had launched himself across the small space between them, wrapping Timothy in his arms and kissing him with all the love and joy he was feeling. Yes, he had whispered against Timothy's lips. Yes, of course, yes. Timothy had laughed, the sound bright and joyful as he spun Alexander around in the small kitchen. When he had finally set Alexander back down, they had both been grinning so widely their cheeks hurt. I love you, Timothy had said, cupping Alexander's face in his hands. I love you, and I want everyone to know it. Alexander had kissed him again, tasting the salt of happy tears on Timothy's lips. I love you too, he had whispered. More than I ever thought it was possible to love someone. They had burned the pasta sauce that night, too distracted by celebration kisses to pay attention to the stove. But neither of them had cared. They had ordered pizza instead and eaten it on the couch, curled together and making plans for their future. The transition to being official boyfriends had been seamless in some ways and revolutionary in others. On the surface, not much had changed. They were still the same two people who had been best friends for years, still comfortable with each other in ways that made their relationship feel natural and easy. But underneath, everything was different. There was a new sense of permanence, a feeling that they were building something lasting and real together. Timothy had moved his belongings into Alexander's room gradually, a few items at a time, until one day Alexander had realized that the space truly belonged to both of them. Timothy's books had found homes on Alexander's shelves. His clothes had taken up residence in Alexander's dresser. His coffee mug had claimed a permanent spot in the kitchen cabinet. The apartment had become truly theirs in a way it never had been before. They had also begun to navigate the social aspects of being a couple, attending parties and gatherings together as boyfriends rather than just friends. Alexander had been nervous about some of these events, worried about how people would react to the change in their relationship, but Timothy had been confident and proud, introducing Alexander as his boyfriend with a smile that had made Alexander's heart soar. The physical aspect of their relationship had continued to evolve as well. Timothy had grown more confident and comfortable with intimacy, and their connection had deepened in ways that had surprised them both. Alexander had been amazed by Timothy's enthusiasm and curiosity, by the way he approached every new experience with openness and joy. But perhaps the most meaningful change had been the way they had learned to support each other through the challenges that came with Timothy's continued journey of self-discovery. There had been moments of doubt and confusion, times when Timothy had struggled with the implications of his changing identity. Alexander had been there through all of it, offering patience and understanding and unconditional love. One particularly difficult evening, about 3 months into their official relationship, Timothy had come home from a visit with his family looking unusually subdued. He had been quiet through dinner, responding to Alexander's attempts at conversation with single-word answers and distracted nods. Finally, Alexander had set down his fork and reached across the table to take Timothy's hand. "Talk to me," he had said gently. "What's going on?" Timothy had looked up at him with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "My dad asked me today if this thing with you was just a phase," he had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He said he was worried that I was just confused, that I would regret throwing away my future for something that might not last." Alexander had felt a surge of protective anger on Timothy's behalf, but he had kept his voice calm and steady. "What did you tell him?" he had asked. Timothy had squeezed Alexander's hand, drawing strength from the contact. "I told him that you're not a phase," he had said, his voice growing stronger. "I told him that what I feel for you is the most real thing I've ever experienced, and that I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Alexander had felt his heart swell with love and pride at Timothy's words. Timothy had continued, his eyes meeting Alexander's with fierce determination. "I told him that I spent years trying to force myself into relationships that didn't fit, because I thought that's what I was supposed to do," he had said. "I told him that being with you feels like coming home, like finally being the person I was always meant to be." The words had been like a balm to Alexander's soul, a reminder of how far they had both come and how strong their connection truly was. He had gotten up from his chair and pulled Timothy into his arms, holding him close while Timothy let out the emotions he had been holding back. "I'm so proud of you," Alexander had whispered into Timothy's hair. "I'm so proud of your courage and your honesty and the way you stand up for us." Timothy had pulled back to look at him, his eyes still bright with tear but also filled with love and determination. "I won't let anyone make me doubt what we have," he had said firmly. "I won't let anyone convince me that this isn't real." Alexander had kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of all the love and support he could offer. They had spent the rest of the evening curled together on the couch, talking through Timothy's fears and reaffirming their commitment to each other. As winter had given way to spring, their relationship had continued to deepen and strengthen. They had developed their own traditions and rituals, little things that belonged only to them. Sunday morning breakfast in bed, evening walks around their neighborhood, late-night conversations that lasted until dawn. Each shared experience had woven them closer together, creating a tapestry of intimacy and connection that felt unbreakable. Alexander had also watched with wonder as Timothy had continued to grow into his identity as a gay man. The initial uncertainty and fear had gradually given way to confidence and pride. Timothy had begun to connect with other LGBTQ individuals, building a community of support and understanding that had enriched his life in ways Alexander had never expected. One evening in late April, they had been getting ready for bed when Timothy had turned to Alexander with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about something," he had said, sitting down on the edge of the bed. Alexander had paused in the middle of brushing his teeth, giving Timothy his attention. "What about?" Alexander had asked after rinsing his mouth. Timothy had patted the bed beside him, and Alexander had sat down, close enough that their knees were touching. "I've been thinking about how different my life is now compared to a year ago," Timothy had said. "How much happier I am, how much more like myself I feel." Alexander had smiled, reaching out to take Timothy's hand. "You seem happier," he had agreed. "More settled, more confident." Timothy had nodded, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of Alexander's hand. "I was talking to my sister yesterday," he had said, "and she told me something that really stuck with me. She said that she had never seen me as comfortable in my own skin as I am now, that it's like I finally found the missing piece of myself." The words had made Alexander's heart warm with happiness and pride. Timothy had continued, his voice soft but certain. "And I realized that she's right," he had said. "For years, I felt like I was living someone else's life, trying to be someone I wasn't. But being with you, being honest about who I am and what I want, it's like I finally get to be myself." Alexander had leaned over to kiss Timothy's temple, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo. "I love who you are," he had whispered. "I love all of you, exactly as you are." Timothy had turned to face him fully, his dark eyes serious and full of love. "I know," he had said simply, "and that's what makes all the difference. Knowing that you love me for who I really am, not for who I was pretending to be." They had made love that night with a tenderness and passion that had left them both breathless, their connection deeper and more meaningful than ever before. Afterward, they had lain tangled together in the darkness, sharing whispered confessions and promises for the future. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you," Timothy had said, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. "I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep in your arms every night. I want to build a home with you, a real home where we can both be completely ourselves." Alexander had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of love and commitment in Timothy's words. "I want that too," he had whispered back. "I want everything with you." They had fallen asleep that night with their fingers intertwined, hearts beating in sync, both of them more certain than ever that they had found something rare and precious and worth fighting for. The months that followed had been filled with the kind of quiet happiness that Alexander had never dared to dream of. They had settled into a rhythm of domestic bliss, sharing responsibilities and supporting each other through the ups and downs of daily life. Timothy had continued to grow more confident in his identity, and Alexander had watched with pride as his boyfriend had become increasingly comfortable with himself and their relationship. They had also begun to make long-term plans together, discussing everything from career goals to travel dreams to the possibility of moving to a larger apartment. Each conversation had reinforced Alexander's certainty that Timothy was the person he wanted to spend his life with, the partner who made him feel complete and whole. One warm evening in June, they had been sitting on their small balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Timothy had been unusually quiet, seeming lost in thought as he stared out at the horizon. "Penny for your thoughts," Alexander had said gently, reaching over to take Timothy's hand. Timothy had turned to look at him, his expression soft and contemplative. "I was just thinking about that night when I first kissed you," he had said, "about how terrified I was that I was going to ruin everything between us." Alexander had smiled at the memory, remembering his own fear and hope from that night. "It seems silly now, doesn't it?" he had said, "being so afraid of something that turned out to be so right." Timothy had nodded, his fingers intertwining with Alexander's. "I keep thinking about all the time we wasted," he had said. "All those months when we were both feeling the same things but too scared to say anything." Alexander had squeezed Timothy's hand, understanding the regret in his voice. "But we found our way to each other eventually," he had said. "That's what matters." Timothy had smiled, the expression bright and full of love. "You're right," he had said, And now we have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time. The words had filled Alexander with a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine or the summer evening. He had leaned over to kiss Timothy, tasting the sweetness of the wine on his lips and feeling grateful for every moment that had led them to this point. As the stars had begun to appear in the darkening sky, they had talked about their hopes and dreams for the future. Timothy had shared his desire to be more open about their relationship, to stop hiding any part of himself from the world. Alexander had talked about his own dreams, about the life he wanted to build with Timothy by his side. "I love you," Timothy had said as they had finally headed inside for the night. "I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." Alexander had pulled Timothy into his arms, holding him close and breathing in the scent of his cologne mixed with the warm summer air. "I love you too," he had whispered. Forever and always. They had made their way to bed that night, with hearts full of love and hope, both of them more certain than ever that they had found their happily ever after in each other. Now, as Alexander sat with Timothy's head resting against his shoulder, he marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. The weight of Timothy's head felt like the most natural thing in the world, a physical reminder of the trust and love they had built together over these past months. Timothy stirred slightly, lifting his head to look at Alexander with eyes that were soft and full of contentment. "Sorry," he said with a sleepy smile. "I didn't mean to use you as a pillow." Alexander reached up to brush a strand of hair away from Timothy's forehead, the gesture as natural as breathing. "You can use me as a pillow anytime you want," he said softly. "I like having you close." Timothy's smile widened, and he leaned in to press a gentle kiss to Alexander's lips. "I still can't believe this is real sometimes," he admitted. "That we found each other, that we get to have this." Alexander cupped Timothy's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across his boyfriend's cheekbones. "It's real," he said firmly. "We're real and we're here and we love each other. That's all that matters." Timothy nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. "I used to think I was broken," he said quietly. "I used to think there was something wrong with me because nothing ever felt right. But now I know I was just waiting for you." The words hit Alexander like a physical force, overwhelming in their sincerity and depth. He pulled Timothy closer, holding him tight against his chest and feeling grateful for every moment of pain and confusion that had led them to this point. "You were never broken," Alexander whispered into Timothy's hair. "You were just becoming who you were meant to be." Timothy pulled back to look at him, his dark eyes serious and full of love. "And who I was meant to be," he said softly, "is yours." Alexander felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of love he felt for this man who had changed his entire world. He kissed Timothy again, pouring all of his love and gratitude into the connection between them. As they settled back into their comfortable position on the couch, Timothy's head once again resting against Alexander's shoulder, Alexander thought about how perfectly this moment encapsulated their entire relationship. The trust, the comfort, the simple joy of being together. Timothy's head falling against his shoulder hadn't been an accident at all. It had been a choice, a conscious decision to seek comfort and closeness in the arms of the person he loved most. And Alexander was more than happy to be that person, to be the safe harbor Timothy came to when he needed peace, to be the steady presence that made Timothy feel at home in his own skin. As the evening light continued to fade around them, Alexander pressed a gentle kiss to the top of Timothy's head and whispered, "I love you." Timothy's response was barely audible, muffled against Alexander's shoulder but clear enough for Alexander to hear. "I love you too," he said, "forever and always." In that moment, with Timothy's weight warm and solid against him, Alexander knew that they had found something rare and precious and worth treasuring. They had found each other, and that was everything.